A sharp, relentless wail sliced through the silence of the estate. Kang Jiseo, barely 4 months old, screamed in a nursery that felt more like a glass-walled cage. The sound vibrated against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling Seoul manor, where every ounce of jade and imported marble couldn't dampen the desperation of the man collapsed on the hardwood. Outside, the city of Seoul was a blur of neon lights and midnight rain, the rest of the world moving in rhythmic indifference, while inside these walls, a man was being dismantled from the inside out. Kang Jae-won. In the smoke-filled backrooms of Gangnam, that name was a death sentence. To the syndicate, he was the Iron King, a man of surgical precision who never hesitated, never bled, and never lowered his guard. But tonight the king was in ruins. His $5,000 black suit was a mess of sweat and wrinkles, the silk tie discarded somewhere near a crib that cost more than a mid-sized car. The white powder of spilled formula coated the floor like a mocking snowfall, marking the evidence of his total failure. 3 times he had tried to quiet the storm. The first bottle had been scorched, the second was a lukewarm disaster, and the third, which he had measured with the focus of a bomb technician, had been batted away by tiny, clenched fists. Jiseo didn't want the milk. He wanted the one thing Jae-won's billions couldn't buy back from the grave. He wanted Carmen. The hands that had once carved up territories and signed off on the ruin of rival families now shook as they cradled 7 pounds of trembling life. The fingers that could disassemble a firearm in total darkness now fumbled uselessly with a plastic nipple as if it were the most intricate puzzle he had ever encountered. The man who could command an army of thousands with a single icy stare was now utterly, pathetically powerless before the cries of his own son. And then a shadow shifted in the doorway. The silence of the Kang estate was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that cost millions to maintain. Built into the side of a cliff overlooking the Han River, the mansion was a fortress of glass and steel, a masterpiece of modern architecture that mirrored its owner's soul, grand, cold, and impenetrable. Under any other circumstances, the only sound permitted within these walls would be the soft hum of the climate control or the rhythmic clicking of Jae-won's polished Oxfords against the marble. But tonight the air was shattered. As the echoes of the nursery faded into a low, exhausted whimper, Jae-won stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the sprawling lights of Seoul. Down there, in the neon-drenched veins of the city, his name was a whispered prayer for some and a death sentence for others. To the 5 families of the Seoul Syndicate, Kang Jae-won was the Iron King, a man who had ascended the throne of the underworld not through luck, but through a terrifying, calculated absence of mercy. He was the man who had neutralized the Incheon rebellion in a single weekend without raising his voice, and whose signature on a ledger could move billions across borders in the blink of an eye. Yet, as he caught his reflection in the dark glass, the man staring back was a stranger. His eyes, usually sharp enough to make seasoned lieutenants look at the floor in fear, were bloodshot and hollow. The sleeves of his tailored shirt were rolled up, revealing the ink of a dragon tattoo that spiraled down his forearm, a mark of a life lived in the shadows, now incongruously dusted with white baby formula. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the vast, empty living space. Everything in the room was a trophy. The Ming Dynasty vase, the original canvases from European masters, the hand-carved mahogany desk where he decided who lived and who broke. In the syndicate, he was surrounded by hundreds of men ready to die for a nod of his head. He held the Iron Throne of the capital, a position of absolute, terrifying reach. But in the grand silence of this house, the power felt like a lead weight. The mansion had once been filled with the scent of jasmine and the soft sound of Carmen's laughter, the only sound that had ever truly belonged in this space. She had been the bridge between the monster the world saw and the man he was supposed to be. Now that bridge was gone. The house felt like a museum of a life he no longer understood. The nursery, tucked away in the west wing, was the only room that felt alive, yet it was also the only room where his authority meant nothing. He walked toward his desk, his fingers grazing the cold wood. A burner phone sat there, vibrating silently with messages from his second-in-command about a shipment intercepted at the docks. Ordinarily, he would have handled the crisis with a single, cold command. Tonight he didn't even pick it up. He just stood there in the center of his kingdom, a king with no subjects who could help him, listening for the one sound that terrified him more than a rival's blade, the return of the silence that meant he was truly alone with his failure. The silence of the mansion was a predator, but in Jae-won's mind, the memories were a haunting sanctuary. He closed his eyes, and suddenly the sterile, cold air of the penthouse was replaced by the scent of sun-warmed jasmine and the lingering heat of a Seoul summer. He was no longer the Iron King standing amidst spilled milk and broken pride. He was simply a man sitting on a terrace, watching Carmen laugh. She had been the only person in his entire life who didn't look at his hands and see the blood they had spilled. When they first met, he had tried to warn her, leaning into the shadows of his reputation to keep her at a distance. He had told her that his world was made of iron and glass, sharp, dangerous and unforgiving. But Carmen, with her defiant, luminous spirit, had only reached out and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the jagged scar along his jawline as if it were a map to a place only she could find. "Then I will be the light that softens the iron," she had whispered. She had kept that promise. For 3 years the mansion hadn't been a fortress, it had been a home. She had filled the hollow corridors with music and vibrant colors, dragging Jae-won out of the dark boardrooms and into the sun. He remembered the afternoon they found out she was pregnant. He had been terrified, not of the rivals who wanted his head, but of the thought that his darkness would inevitably stain the life they were creating. "He won't be like me," Jae-won had sworn one evening, his voice thick with a rare raw desperation as he rested his forehead against her swelling stomach. "I will build a wall so high the business will never even cast a shadow on him. He will never know the weight of a gun or the sound of a scream. I'll give him a world that is clean." Carmen had tucked a lock of her dark hair behind her ear, her expression softening into that knowing, tragic beauty she carried. "It's not enough to build walls, Jae-won," she had told him. "You have to be the one to lead him into the light. You can't just hide the dark, you have to outshine it." The memory shifted, turning cold and jagged as it hit the night of the delivery, the night the light had finally flickered and gone out. In her final moments, as her breath grew shallow and the monitors beeped with a terrifying finality, Carmen had gripped his hand with a strength that defied her fading life. Her eyes had searched his, pleading for one last vow. "Protect our son," she had gasped, "but don't let him grow up in a cage of your making. Let him see the man I saw." Now, standing in the center of a mansion that felt more like a tomb than a palace, Jae-won felt the crushing weight of that broken promise. He had built the walls, yes. He had kept the syndicate outside the gates. But in doing so, he had become a ghost in his own home, a man so afraid of his own shadow that he had forgotten how to offer his son the warmth Carmen had died to preserve. The Iron King was still ruling from a throne of silence, but as the ghost of Carmen's laughter echoed in his mind, he realized that he wasn't protecting Jiseo. He was drowning him in the same darkness he had tried so hard to escape. The red-rimmed eyes and the slight tremor in Jae-won's hands did not go unnoticed the following afternoon in the soundproofed boardroom of the Kong Corporation. In the world of the Seoul Syndicate, weakness was not an illness. It was a scent, and it smelled like blood in the water. Jae-won sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his signature black suit back in place, but the iron mask he usually wore was slipping. For the first time in a decade, the Iron King looked tired. Across from him, Park Min-ho, a high-ranking lieutenant with a jagged scar and an even more jagged ambition, watched his boss with the cold intensity of a predator measuring a fading alpha. Min-ho had spent years in Jae-won's shadow, waiting for a crack to appear in the glass. He noticed the way Jae-won stared at a simple logistics report for 3 seconds too long. He saw the way the boss's phone, usually silent during these high-stakes briefings, sat face down on the table, vibrating with the frantic persistence of a nursery monitor. "The shipment from Busan is delayed, Chairman," Min-ho said, his voice smooth but laced with a subtle, testing defiance. "The customs officials are asking for a direct meeting. They say the Iron King has been unusually quiet lately. They're wondering if the crown has become too heavy." The room went deathly silent. A year ago, such a comment would have resulted in Min-ho being dragged from the room. But Jae-won only blinked, his mind momentarily trapped in the memory of Jaeseo's heat against his chest and the terrifying sound of the infant's breath catching in a sob. He didn't snap. He didn't even look up. "Handle it, Min-ho," Jae-won replied, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual lethal edge. A ripple of uneasy glances exchanged between the other lieutenants. To them this wasn't mercy, it was abdication. They saw a man whose soul was being eaten by a ghost and a crying child. In the back of the room, whispers began to stir like a rising tide. If the king couldn't even control his own household, how could he control the docks? If his hands were too shaky to hold a bottle, how could they hold a gun? As the meeting adjourned, Min-ho lingered in the doorway, watching Jae-won rub his temples in the dim light of the setting sun. The lieutenant pulled his own phone from his pocket and sent a short, encrypted message to the rival factions waiting in the wings. "The king is distracted. The gates are unlocked." Jae-won felt the shift in the room's temperature, the invisible withdrawal of loyalty that usually hummed through the air. He knew that by choosing to be a father for even a few hours a night, he was inviting a coup. He was the most powerful man in the city, but as he sat alone in the darkening boardroom, he realized the terrifying truth of his new life. To save his son's future, he might have to lose his kingdom, but to keep his kingdom, he would surely lose his soul. The mutiny wasn't just coming from the streets, it was rising from the very floorboards of his empire, fueled by the scent of a man who had finally found something he was afraid to lose. The boardroom felt miles away, its cold logic replaced by the frantic, humid reality of the nursery. Jae-won stood over the kitchen island, the overhead lights reflecting off his damp forehead as he stared at the digital thermometer. His movements were jerky, stripped of the grace that usually defined him. In his world, a millimeter was the difference between life and death. Here, a few degrees were a chasm he couldn't cross. He poured the formula into the glass bottle for the fourth time that night. His calloused fingers, which could strip a handgun in seconds, fumbled with the plastic ring. He tried to recall the video Carmen had once shown him, her voice light and patient as she explained the perfect wrist drop test. But his hands were trembling, vibrating with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. When he tipped the bottle, the milk came out in a hot, aggressive stream. Too hot. Again. In the nursery, Jisoo's crying had shifted from a plea to a jagged rhythmic roar, a sound that tore through Jae-won's chest like a serrated blade. He dumped the milk into the sink, the white liquid swirling down the drain like his fading composure. He started over, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He measured the water, his eyes squinting at the lines on the glass. He shook the bottle, the sound of the mixing powder echoing in the silent kitchen like a ticking clock. This time it was too cold. The thermometer mocked him with its digital indifference. He returned to the nursery, trying to soothe the infant with nothing but his presence. He lifted Jisoo, attempting to cradle him with the softness Carmen had possessed. But his arms were rigid, his shoulders hunched with the tension of a man expecting an ambush. He rocked back and forth, but his rhythm was off, a soldier's march instead of a father's sway. Jisoo only screamed louder, his tiny face a shade of desperate purple, his fists beating against Jae-won's chest as if trying to push away the cold, hard man who was failing him. The rejection was physical. It was a verdict. Jae-won looked down at the child, and for a terrifying second, he didn't see his son. He saw his own failure made flesh. He saw the Iron King reduced to a helpless bystander in his own tragedy. He retreated back to the kitchen to try one last time, his movements becoming frantic. He reached for the bottle warmer, but his sleeve caught the edge of a ceramic bowl, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. As he reached for the fifth bottle, his grip, the famous, unbreakable grip of the Soul Syndicate, finally snapped. The glass bottle slipped from his sweaty palm. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline explosion, shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds. White milk splattered across his black trousers, soaking into the fabric, pooling around his expensive shoes. Jae-won didn't move. He stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The crying from the other room continued, unabated and piercing, but Jae-won remained frozen. The king was defeated. Surrounded by his wealth, his power, and his shattered attempts at love, he was nothing more than a man standing in a pool of spilled milk, waiting for a mercy he didn't know how to ask for. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 5, where Shirley finally steps out of the shadows to intervene? The sound of the shattering glass was followed by a silence so sudden and absolute that it felt like the very air had been sucked out of the kitchen. Jae-won stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on the jagged shards and the white river of milk seeping into the grout. The crying from the nursery had reached a fever pitch, a raw, primal sound that seemed to mock his every failure. He felt the darkness closing in, the same cold void that had claimed his heart the night Carmen died. Then, a soft, deliberate shift in the atmosphere made the hair on the back of his neck rise. It wasn't the sudden movement of an assassin or the hurried pace of a frightened servant. It was a presence, steady, heavy, and patient. Jae-won turned slowly, his eyes narrowing through the film of his own exhaustion. Shirley D. Buckman stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the dim amber light of the hallway. She wore her traditional maid's uniform, the white apron crisp against the dark fabric, but her posture held none of the subservience he usually demanded from his staff. She looked less like an employee and more like a sentinel. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a platitude or a gasp of shock at the mess. Instead, she simply watched him with eyes that had seen far more than the inside of this mansion. For weeks, Shirley had been the silent witness to his slow-motion collapse. She had watched from the shadows as the Iron King paced the halls at 4 a.m. until his footsteps faltered. She had seen him sit in his office for hours, staring at a phone that never rang with the voice he wanted to hear. She had observed the way he held the baby, as if Jo were a fragile bomb he was terrified to trigger. Jae-won felt a sudden, irrational surge of shame. He was a man who ruled through the projection of invincibility, yet here he was, caught in the wreckage of a baby bottle by a woman he had barely spoken a word to in a year. "I told you I didn't want to be disturbed," he rasped, his voice cracking with the strain of suppressed emotion. Shirley stepped into the kitchen, her movements fluid and calm. She didn't look at the shattered glass, she looked directly at him. "You aren't being disturbed, Mr. Kang," she said, her voice a deep, resonant calm that seemed to lower the temperature of his panic. "You're being watched. There is a difference." She walked past him toward the sink, her presence a stark contrast to his jagged energy. She had waited for this moment. The moment where the iron finally bent, where the king realized that a kingdom was a hollow thing when there was no one left to share the silence. She had held her peace while he tried to command grief like an army, knowing that the only way for him to truly hear what she had to say was for him to first reach the end of himself. "The baby isn't crying because the milk is cold," she said softly, reaching for a fresh bottle with a practiced ease. "He's crying because he can feel your hands shaking. He's crying for the same reason you are." Jae-won flinched as if she had struck him. He wanted to dismiss her, to roar at her to leave, but the weight of the letter she held tucked into the pocket of her apron, a secret she had guarded since the night of Carmen's last breath, seemed to exert a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. He stood in the pool of milk, his armor finally cracked, watching the woman who had been a ghost in his house finally step into the light. Jae-won stood motionless, the sharp tang of spilled milk rising from the floor as he watched Shirley reach into the deep pocket of her apron. The air in the kitchen, once frantic with the sound of his own heavy breathing and the infant's distant cries, suddenly turned heavy with the weight of something unsaid. Shirley's fingers emerged holding a cream-colored envelope, its edges slightly worn as if it had been carried for a long time, waiting for this exact moment of ruin. "What is that?" Jae-won asked, his voice a ghost of the authority he usually wielded. He didn't move to take it. He was a man who had spent his life deciphering threats, but the sight of his wife's elegant cursive script on the front of that envelope terrified him more than any rival's blade. "It is the reason I am still in this house, Mr. Kang," Shirley replied, her voice steady and resonant. She stepped across the kitchen, her shoes clicking softly against the marble, unaffected by the chaos of the spilled powder or the tension radiating from him. She held the letter out, but she didn't drop it into his hand. She forced him to reach for it to acknowledge his own need. "Mrs. Kang gave this to me 3 nights before she went to the hospital for the last time. She was sitting in that nursery watching the sun go down, and she looked at me with a look that said she already knew she wouldn't be coming back to finish what she started." Jae-won's fingers brushed against the paper, and the contact felt like an electric shock. "Why now?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on Carmen's handwriting. "Why did you wait until I was like this?" Shirley didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression filled with a weary, knowing compassion. "Because she knew you," she said simply. "She knew the Iron King didn't know how to bend. She knew you would be too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit that the walls you built were suffocating you. She told me, 'Shirley, my husband is a man who thinks he can outthink the dark. He will try to handle the grief like a business deal. He will try to command our son like a soldier. And he will break himself trying to be perfect.'" Jae-won felt a lump form in his throat, a physical obstruction that made it hard to swallow. He looked down at the envelope, his vision blurring. "She asked me to wait," Shirley continued, her voice softening. "She asked me to watch you, to stay in the shadows and to wait until you fell. She said you had to reach the bottom of your own strength before you would be ready to listen to her heart. She didn't want to save you from the struggle, Mr. Kang. She wanted the struggle to change you." Jae-won's grip tightened on the paper, the expensive suit jacket feeling like a straitjacket he was finally ready to shed. The crying in the nursery had dipped into a low, mournful whimper, as if the child was waiting for the outcome of this conversation. Jae-won looked at the woman who had been a silent ghost in his home, realizing she was the only bridge left to the light. With trembling fingers, he finally broke the seal, the scent of Carmen's jasmine perfume faintly rising from the paper, a final message from the woman who had seen the man behind the mask long before he had found the courage to see himself. The paper felt like a living thing in Jae-won's hands, warm and fragile against his calloused skin. As he unfolded the pages, the scent of jasmine, faint but unmistakable, rose from the fibers, momentarily drowning out the sour smell of spilled milk. Outside the nursery, the rain continued its rhythmic assault on the glass, but inside the kitchen, The world had narrowed to the loops and curves of Carmen's handwriting. My dearest Jaewon, the letter began, her voice practically speaking the words in his ear. If you are reading this, it means the silence of the house has finally become too loud to ignore. It means you are standing in the dark, trying to be the man the world fears, while our son is asking for the man I loved. Jaewon's breath hitched. He sank onto the floor, heedless of the milk soaking into his trousers or the glass shards nearby. He leaned his back against the cold marble island, his eyes scanning the lines with a desperate hunger. I knew who you were from the very first night, the letter continued. I knew about the shadows you moved in, the phone calls you took in the garden, and the blood that sometimes stained your cuffs when you thought I wasn't looking. My friends warned me. My family begged me to run. They saw the Iron King, a monster who built an empire on fear. But they didn't see what I saw that evening in the clinic when you brought in that stray dog with the broken leg. Jaewon closed his eyes, a forgotten memory resurfacing. A rain-soaked night years ago, long before the crown felt this heavy. You thought you were being careful, Carmen wrote, but I saw your hands. The same hands that people say are made of stone were shaking as you held that terrified creature. I saw the way you touched its fur, with a gentleness so profound it broke my heart. You tried to hide it, retreating back into your cold stares and your silence, but I knew then that your power was just a suit of armor you wore to protect a heart that was too soft for the world you were born into. A single tear escaped Jaewon's eye, tracing a path through the sweat and grime on his face. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had just shattered a bottle in a fit of powerless rage. You will try to rule Jaseo the way you rule Seoul, the letter warned. You will try to be perfect because you are afraid that if you show him your weakness, the world will take him from you. But Jaewon, he doesn't need a king. He needs those gentle hands. He needs the man who was brave enough to love me despite the darkness. Don't be afraid to break, my love. Only the things that break can be put back together into something new. I didn't stay because of your strength. I stayed because I saw the man you were trying to hide. Now let him out. For him. For us. The letter ended with a simple, devastating command. Go to him. Jaewon folded the paper with trembling fingers and tucked it against his chest, right over his heart. The weight that had been crushing his lungs for 100 days didn't disappear, but it shifted. For the first time since the funeral, the air felt possible to breathe. He looked up at Shirley, who was still standing by the sink, her expression unreadable but her presence a steady anchor in the storm. The crying in the next room had softened to a tired, rhythmic hiccup. Jaewon wiped his face with his sleeve, stood up amongst the wreckage of his pride, and walked toward the nursery, not as a king going to battle but as a father finally coming home. The transformation did not begin with a grand speech, but with a series of quiet, lethal decisions made in the pale blue light of dawn. Jaewon sat in his study, the nursery monitor hummed softly beside him, transmitting the steady rhythmic breathing of a finally sleeping Jihyo. The letter from Carmen lay flat on the desk, its edges weighted down by his heavy gold watch, a relic of a man who no longer existed. When the burner phone on his desk vibrated, he didn't hesitate. He summoned his 3 top captains, the men who held the keys to the syndicate's most shadow-drenched operations. They arrived within the hour, their expressions taut, expecting a declaration of war against the rivals who had been circling the docks. They filed into the room, bringing with them the cold scent of the streets and the sharp anticipation of violence. Park Min-ho stood at the front, his eyes searching Jaewon's face for the weakness he had sensed earlier. The weapons shipment is being moved to the secondary warehouse, Chairman, Min-ho reported, his hand hovering near his jacket as if ready to draw. Give us the word and we'll burn every rival name in the city by sunrise. We're ready to show them that the Iron King hasn't softened. Jaewon looked at him, but for the first time he didn't see a loyal lieutenant. He saw a threat to the world he needed to build for his son. He leaned back in the leather chair, his hands clasped, no longer shaking, but possessed of a new, terrifyingly calm clarity. There will be no hits tonight, Min-ho, Jaewon said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the room. And there will be no more shipments of that nature. Starting today we are liquidating the frontline armaments. Every asset tied to the human trafficking routes and the narcotics distribution in the north is to be dismantled. Immediately. A stunned, suffocating silence fell over the captains. Min-ho took a step forward, his face contorting in disbelief. Dismantled? Chairman, those are our most profitable veins. You're cutting off our own hands. The other families will tear us apart if we show this kind of mercy. It isn't mercy, Jaewon replied, his gaze locking onto Min-ho's with an intensity that made the younger man flinch. It is cleaning the house. I am removing the rot that makes this world unsafe for my son. Any man who cannot envision a future where we don't trade in blood is free to leave this room now. But if you stay, you follow my new directive. We are pivoting to legitimate logistics and construction. We are building things that last, not things that kill. Minho's jaw tightened, the mutiny in his heart visible in the twitch of his eye. You're choosing a child over an empire. I am choosing a legacy over a graveyard, Jae-won corrected. He stood up, the authority radiating from him more powerful than it had ever been when he ruled through fear alone. I am the Iron King. I built this world and I will be the one to tear it down to make room for the light. Now go. Begin the transfers. Anyone who resists is to be retired quietly. As they filed out, Minho the last among them, Jae-won didn't watch them go. He turned back to the monitor, listening to the soft sigh of his son's sleep. He knew the war was far from over. In many ways the real fight had just begun. But as he looked at Carmen's letter one last time, he knew he was finally using his power for the only thing that mattered. The transition had begun. The ghost was fading and a father was rising in his place. The storm that had ravaged the estate for 100 days did not end with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, persistent arrival of the dawn. Beyond the reinforced glass of the nursery, the rain had finally tapered off, leaving the Seoul skyline bathed in a fragile, pearlescent gray. The neon lights of the city below began to flicker out, one by one as the first true light of morning touched the Han River. Inside, the frantic energy of the night had dissolved into a profound stillness. The air no longer smelled of spilled milk and desperation, but of the soft, powdery scent of a clean infant and the cooling embers of a man's spent rage. Jae-won sat in the velvet rocking chair, the one Carmen had chosen because she said the color reminded her of a twilight sky. His head was tilted back against the cushion, his jaw relaxed for the first time since the funeral. The Iron King was gone, replaced by a man whose expensive suit was ruined beyond repair, but whose spirit was finally beginning to mend. Cradled against his chest, wrapped in a fresh, light blanket, was Jae-seo. The infant's fists were no longer clenched in distress. They were tucked softly under his chin, rising and falling in perfect synchronization with his father's breath. The silence that had once been a weapon of isolation had transformed into a sanctuary. Jae-won's large, calloused hand remained draped protectively over the small of the baby's back, a silent promise kept in the depths of sleep. Shirley stood in the doorway watching the father and son through the soft, morning haze. She had spent the last hour quietly cleaning the wreckage of the kitchen, sweeping up the diamonds of broken glass and mopping away the evidence of the night's failures. She had seen Jae-won survive the darkest hours of his soul, and she knew that the man who woke up today would be different from the one who had collapsed on the floor at midnight. He was still a man of iron, but the iron had been forged into something that could finally hold a life without crushing it. She walked into the room with the practiced, silent gait of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the shadows of other people's grief. She didn't wake him. She knew that this rest was the most important work he had done in years. Reaching down, she picked up a discarded cashmere throw from the edge of the crib and draped it gently over Jae-won's shoulders, tucking it around the edges of the sleeping baby. For a moment she paused, her hand resting near the letter that peeked out from Jae-won's pocket. She looked at the photograph of Carmen on the nightstand, the woman who had seen the gentle hands, when no one else would. Shirley offered a small, knowing nod to the picture, a silent confirmation that the task was complete. The secret was out, the king had fallen, and the father had been found. As Shirley stepped back into the hallway, the first beam of golden sunlight cleared the horizon, flooding the nursery with warmth. It caught the edges of the crib and the sleeping figures in the chair, turning the gray shadows into a promise of a new day. The crying had stopped, the house was clean, and for the first time in a long time, the Iron Throne was empty because the man who occupied it had found something far more powerful to hold.